Welcome, friends, to another bedtime journey. Tonight, we'll drift into the world of Final Fantasy VIII, a tale of love, fate, and time itself. As you get comfortable, let the story carry you away into dreams. And if you enjoy these stories, I invite you to softly press like, share this with someone who might need a peaceful escape, and subscribe so you don't miss the adventures yet to come. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us grow together in this little corner of calm. Balamb Garden stood at the edge of the sea like a quiet promise, its pale walls glowing softly as waves rolled in below. The academy breathed with a gentle rhythm, footsteps in distant halls, the hum of machinery beneath the floors, the faint sound of wind drifting through open walkways. It was a place built to shape warriors, yet in the early hours, it felt almost peaceful. Inside the training center, steel rang out in clean, deliberate strikes. Squall Leonhart moved with disciplined precision, his gun blade an extension of his thoughts rather than his emotions. Each motion was controlled, efficient, and exact. His instructor pressed him hard, but Squall showed no frustration, no triumph, only focus. Words were unnecessary. Feelings were distractions. What mattered was mastery. When the session ended, Squall left without ceremony, his footsteps echoing as he walked alone through the garden's curved corridors. Around him, other students gathered in small groups, voices overlapping with nervous laughter and quiet worry. Tomorrow was the seed exam, the moment that would decide who belonged to the elite mercenary force and who would remain behind. Zell Dinched filled the space wherever he stood. He bounced on his heels, stretching his arms, shadowboxing imaginary opponents while assuring himself, loudly, that he was completely ready. Every so often, his confidence slipped, only to be quickly patched over with more enthusiasm. He had trained hard, and he wanted everyone, including himself, to know it. Nearby, Cypher Almasi leaned casually against a wall, gunblade resting across his shoulder. His smirk came easily, his words even easier. He spoke of glory, of fate, of becoming a legendary seed who would change the world. Rules, to Cypher, were suggestions at best. Discipline was something to be challenged, not followed. He looked toward the future as if it already belonged to him. Elsewhere in the garden, Selphie Tilmit wandered with wide-eyed curiosity, peering over railings and marveling at how everything looked at night. She talked about transfers and festivals and how exciting it was to be somewhere new, treating the looming exam like the beginning of a journey rather than a trial. Fear barely seemed to touch her, replaced instead with genuine wonder. As evening settled in, Squall found himself drawn back to solitude. He stood near the railing overlooking the sea, listening to the waves below. A familiar melody drifted through his thoughts, soft, distant, and impossible to place. It stirred something he couldn't name, a feeling just beneath the surface, quickly buried by habit and restraint. Tomorrow, the fire cavern would open. Tomorrow, the seed exam would begin. And though none of them realized it yet, the quiet order of Balamb Garden was already starting to shift, preparing to give way to a story shaped by memory, time, and choices that could never be undone. Morning arrived gently at Balamb Garden, the sea calm and silver beneath a pale sky. Orders were given quietly, efficiently. The exam had begun. Squall was assigned his team without discussion. Zell Dinched, still buzzing with nervous energy, and Selphie Tilmit, smiling as if this were a field trip rather than a trial that could change their lives. With weapons ready and time limits set, they set out toward the fire cavern, the garden shrinking behind them. The path grew warmer with every step. Stone walls narrowed, and the air thickened until each breath felt heavier than the last. Lava flowed in slow, glowing streams, casting a steady orange light that made shadows stretch and sway. Squall led without hesitation, his mind fixed on efficiency and timing. Zell kept close, fists clenched, occasionally whispering encouragement to himself. Selphie glanced around in quiet awe, commenting on how beautiful the fire looked, as if it were a sunset rather than a warning. At the cavern's core, the heat intensified, and the flames gathered as though drawn by an unseen will. Fire rose and shaped itself into a towering presence, Ifrit, ancient and watchful. The ground trembled slightly as he tested them, his power pressing down like a challenge written in flame. Squall stepped forward, movements calm and deliberate, the gunblade flashing in the firelight. Zell fought with unrestrained determination, throwing himself into the moment with everything he had. Selphie moved with lightness and trust, supporting without fear. The battle flowed like a rhythm. Strike, flame, resolve. Until at last the fire subsided. Ifrit knelt, acknowledging their strength. The cavern exhaled, and the heat eased just enough to remind them that time had never stopped moving. The real exam was already underway elsewhere. They returned quickly, barely pausing before boarding transport to Dollet. The peaceful hum of engines soon gave way to the distant thunder of artillery. As they landed, the sound of war surrounded them. Gunfire echoing through stone streets, smoke rising in uneven plumes. This was no simulation. Orders crackled over radios, and the weight of reality settled in. Squall moved through the city with controlled focus, issuing brief commands that kept the team aligned. Zell surged forward with enthusiasm, sometimes a step too far, then corrected himself with embarrassed speed. Selphie provided cover and support, her cheerful calm oddly grounding amid the chaos. Above them, the radio carried news of Cypher's advance, reckless, aggressive, chasing his own version of heroism without regard for command. As the mission pressed on, a massive presence stirred offshore, metal and menace silhouetted against the sea. The withdrawal order came, and the team moved fast, footsteps pounding against stone as they retreated towards safety. The city faded behind them, but the echo of conflict lingered. When it was over, silence returned in fragments. The exam had tested more than skill. It had revealed instincts, flaws, and quiet strengths. As night approached once more, Balamb Garden awaited their return, unchanged on the surface, yet already beginning to feel like a place they were slowly leaving behind. Balamb Garden welcomed them back with polished floors and quiet order, as if the chaos of Dollet had never touched its walls. The sea still shimmered beyond the railings, calm and indifferent. Yet something had changed. The exam was over, and the waiting began. Students gathered in the main hall, standing straighter than usual, uniforms neat, expressions carefully composed. Names were called one by one. Some were chosen, some were not. When Squall Leonhart's name echoed through the room, there was no visible reaction, just a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement. He had passed. He was now seed. Zell's relief came all at once, his excitement barely contained as he realized he had made it too. Selphie's smile widened, her joy effortless and bright. Around them, applause rose and fell in polite waves. Nearby, Cypher stood apart. His name was not called. His expression hardened, pride clashing with disbelief. Without a word, he turned and walked away. That night, the garden transformed. Lights softened, music drifted through the air. The rigid atmosphere of training gave way to something gentler as the graduation celebration began. Squall stood stiffly in his uniform, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar expectation of dancing and conversation. He planned to remain unnoticed, to let the night pass quietly. Then she appeared. Rinoa heartily moved through the crowd with natural ease, her presence warm and unmistakable. She took Squall's hand without hesitation, pulling him onto the dance floor as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The music swelled, and though Squall's movements were awkward, she laughed softly, guiding him through each step. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to the sound of music and the rhythm of shared motion. As the dance ended, she smiled at him, open, curious, unguarded, and thanked him before disappearing back into the crowd. Squall stood alone once more, the melody lingering in his mind, the feeling unfamiliar and unresolved. Later, Rinoa returned, this time with purpose. She spoke of timber, of resistance, of a mission that needed Seed's help. Her words carried urgency beneath their light tone. Squall listened, reserved as ever, but orders were orders, and contracts were contracts. By the time the night grew quiet again, the celebration faded, and the garden settled back into stillness, Squall found himself standing at another edge, no longer just a student, but a mercenary, stepping into a world already in motion. The train hummed steadily as it cut through the night, its windows reflecting flickering lights and passing shadows. Timber approached quietly, a city worn thin by occupation and watchful eyes. Squall stood near the door of the carriage, arms crossed, posture firm, listening more than speaking. Across from him, Rinoa tried to explain the plan with confidence, though it was clear she was holding more hope than certainty. Zell nodded along enthusiastically, already convinced the mission would go smoothly. Selphie leaned against a seat, fascinated by the idea of real resistance work, while quietly trying to remember which switch did what. The plan was simple enough. Uncouple the presidential car, secure the target, escape before Galbadia could respond. Simple plans, however, rarely stayed that way. As the train slowed, the team moved into position. Metal clanked softly as they climbed between cars, the wind rushing past in sharp bursts. Squall's grip was steady, his focus absolute. Timing mattered. Precision mattered. Somewhere along the way, wires were crossed, literally and figuratively, and the operation unraveled in a series of small, unforgiving mistakes. The wrong car. The wrong moment. The realization came too late. Inside, Galbadia's president was not who he seemed. The team withdrew quickly, slipping back into the shadows as alarms began to stir. Timber responded with fear rather than rebellion. Soldiers flooded the streets. The weight of occupation pressed down harder than before. Afterward, they regrouped in quiet frustration. Rinoa's optimism dimmed, replaced with guilt she tried to hide behind hurried explanations. Squall said little. The mission had failed. That was all that mattered. As Galbadia tightened its grip on Timber, trains rolled on, broadcasts filled the airwaves, and something far darker began to surface beyond the city's worn platforms. The resistance had been seen. And somewhere beyond Timber, power was gathering. Patient, deliberate, and watching. The world shifted its tone almost overnight. Galbadia's broadcasts filled the airwaves, their voices smooth and confident as they announced a new era of order. At the center of it stood a single figure, her image carried from city to city, from screen to screen. Sorceress Adia. Tall, composed, wrapped in black and gold, she spoke with calm authority, her words heavy with inevitability. Where her shadow fell, resistance quieted. Dealing City prepared for celebration. Streets were cleaned, banners raised, and crowds gathered beneath towering arches as if the future itself were about to pass through on display. Squall and the others moved among the preparations, uneasy in the artificial cheer. Rinoa tried to make sense of it all, her voice lower now, her confidence more cautious. Something about Edea felt wrong, like a pressure just beneath the surface of the air. When the parade began, the city held its breath. Music echoed between buildings as the procession advanced, soldiers marching in perfect rhythm. And then she appeared. Edea rose above the crowd, elevated and untouchable, her presence commanding silence without a word. The cheers faded into murmurs, then into something closer to reverence. Power radiated from her, not loud or violent, but absolute. At her side stood a familiar figure. Cypher Almasi stepped forward, no longer a student, no longer restrained by garden rules. His posture was proud, his expression sharp with purpose. He knelt before Edea, pledging himself as her knight, as if this moment had been waiting for him all along. The dream of glory he had spoken about so often had finally found its shape, though not the one anyone had expected. From the crowd, Squall watched in silence. The sight of Cypher there, so certain, so consumed by his chosen role, stirred something uncomfortable. Not anger, not betrayal, something heavier, something unresolved. As the parade passed and the city exhaled once more, the truth settled in quietly. Galbadia was no longer just a nation at war. It was something else now, guided by a sorceress, protected by a knight, and moving forward with a calm confidence that promised there would be no turning back. Night settled over Dealing City with a polished stillness, lights glowing softly against stone and glass. Beneath the calm surface, plans moved quietly into place. Squall listened as orders were laid out with careful precision. The mission was simple in theory and heavy in consequence. An assassination meant to end the sorceress's influence before it could fully take root. A new face joined them, leaning back with an easy confidence that felt almost out of place. Irvine Kinneas introduced himself with a grin and a casual wave, his cowboy hat tilted just enough to suggest he'd done this sort of thing before. He spoke lightly, joked easily, and treated the weight of the moment like an old friend. His role was clear: one shot, one chance. As positions were taken, the city seemed to hold its breath. Squall moved through narrow corridors and quiet stairwells, his thoughts locked on timing and execution. Rinoa stayed behind, worry tugging at her despite her resolve. Zell and Selphie waited tensely, nerves stretched thin. Irvine, rifle in hand, finally grew quiet, the humor draining away as reality pressed in. The signal came. Edea rose once more, framed by light and shadow, her presence unchanged, calm, composed, untouchable. Irvine steadied his aim, finger poised, breath measured. The moment stretched, fragile and thin. Then doubt crept in, heavy and paralyzing. His hands trembled. The shot never came. Everything unraveled at once. Cypher stepped forward, blade flashing as chaos erupted. Guards surged, magic cracked through the air. Squall charged without hesitation, closing the distance in a blur of instinct and steel. For a heartbeat, it felt possible. Then pain tore through him, sharp and sudden. He fell, the world spinning as Edea's power flared cold and absolute. As darkness closed in, the city's lights blurred and the plan dissolved into fragments. The attempt had failed. The sorceress remained. And somewhere between falling and silence, Squall slipped into a quiet void, the echoes of everything unfinished fading into black. Cold returned before sound did. Squall woke to darkness and the dull ache of his own breathing, each inhale measured and shallow. The world felt distant, as if he were listening to it through thick walls. When his vision finally focused, iron bars framed the space around him, stretching upward into shadow. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of rust and old stone. D-District Prison rose endlessly, a tower built not just to confine bodies, but to wear down resolve. Nearby, Zell's voice broke the silence, strained but unmistakably alive. Relief came quietly, without ceremony. Selphie's presence followed soon after, her attempts at optimism softer than usual, careful not to crack under the weight of where they were. Rinoa was there too, pacing the narrow space, worry etched into every movement. The plan was gone. The city was behind them. All that remained was survival. High above, alarms echoed faintly through the structure as guards moved with routine indifference. The prison operated like a machine, cells descending and rising, prisoners shifted without explanation. Squall's thoughts stayed clear despite the pain. Waiting wasn't an option. It never was. Opportunity arrived in fragments, a careless guard, a dropped weapon, a moment where the rhythm of the prison slipped. Squall moved when it mattered, pain ignored, instincts sharp. Cells opened. Corridors blurred into narrow paths of escape. Somewhere along the way, Zell's restraint gave way to cathartic fury, his strikes echoing louder than the alarms. Selphie moved with surprising calm, focused and steady. Rinoa stayed close, fear tempered by trust. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly beneath a burning sky. Freedom tasted dry and uncertain, but it was freedom nonetheless. The prison loomed behind them, silent once more, as if it had never noticed their escape at all. As they regrouped and moved on, the reality settled in slowly. The mission had failed. The sorceress remained. Cypher stood at her side. And Seed, once a structured path forward, now felt scattered, its purpose unclear. Yet despite the loss, despite the unanswered questions, one thing remained unchanged. Squall was still moving forward, even wounded, even uncertain. And somewhere ahead, the story was tightening its grip, pulling them all towards something far larger than a single battle ever could be. Balamb Garden drifted across the plains like a living thing, its massive structure humming softly as hidden engines carried it forward. Inside, confusion spread quietly through the halls. Orders overlapped, communications faltered. The familiar certainty of garden life had begun to crack. Squall moved through it all with a steady calm, though the weight of recent events lingered beneath every step. Soon, the reason for the unrest revealed itself. Galbadia Garden approached from the horizon, its presence unmistakable, its intent clear. The two academies, once distant rivals, were on a collision course. There would be no negotiation, no retreat. As alarms sounded, instructors and students alike prepared for battle. Squall found himself surrounded by eyes waiting for direction. Without ceremony, without time to reflect, leadership settled onto his shoulders. Commands came naturally, clipped and efficient, guiding Seed forces into position as the gardens closed in on one another. The impact shook the ground. Metal groaned. Structures collided. What followed was chaos, suspended between discipline and desperation. Squall fought through narrow corridors and open platforms, issuing orders as instinct took over. Zell followed with fierce loyalty, throwing himself into the fight with everything he had. Selphie moved with quiet focus, her usual brightness replaced by determination. Rinoa stayed close, watching Squall carefully, seeing the weight he refused to acknowledge. In the heart of the conflict, Squall confronted Cypher once more. Steel met steel, familiar movements clashing with bitter purpose. Cypher fought with reckless intensity, driven by his devotion to Edea and the role he had chosen. Squall countered with control and resolve, neither taunting nor pleading, only finishing what needed to be done. When Cypher fell, defeated but unbroken, the battle shifted. Balamb Garden withdrew. The clash ended as abruptly as it had begun. As the dust settled, silence returned in uneven waves. Balamb Garden remained standing, but something fundamental had changed. Squall stood alone for a moment, overlooking the field below. He had not asked for command, yet it had found him all the same. The world was no longer something he could move through quietly. It was asking something of him now. And whether he welcomed it or not, Squall Leonhart had begun to answer. Balamb Garden moved onward beneath a quiet sky, its great engine steady, its halls subdued. The battle had passed, but its echo lingered in every corridor. Students spoke in softer tones. Instructors watched more closely. The garden was still a school, still a refuge, yet something sharper lived within it now. Squall stood before them all, the weight of command settling fully into place. Orders were no longer suggestions passed down from above, they came from him. He listened, considered, and spoke when necessary, his voice calm and even. Leadership did not change his expression, but it changed how others looked at him. Expectation followed him like a shadow. Rinoa noticed it most. She watched him from a distance at first, then closer, seeing the way responsibility wrapped around him, tightening with each decision. She tried to lighten the moments when she could, offering warmth where the garden felt colder than before. Squall accepted it quietly, unsure what to do with care that asked for nothing in return. Cypher's defeat did not bring closure. He was taken, bound not by chains alone, but by the path he had chosen. The sorceress remained beyond reach, her influence stretching far beyond the battlefield. Even in absence, Edea's presence felt constant, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. As Balamb Garden drifted across open land, Squall found little rest. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams that felt more like memories, faces half-remembered, laughter echoing from somewhere distant, a shoreline washed in fading light. He woke each time with the same quiet certainty that something important lay just out of reach. Yet the garden continued forward, carrying them all with it, toward answers, toward confrontation, toward truths that had waited far longer than any of them could remember. The ruins stood quietly beneath an open sky, stone worn smooth by years of wind and tide. Waves rolled in gently, their rhythm slow and patient, as if the world itself had chosen this place to remember. Squall stepped forward first, boots sinking slightly into the sand as something deep and unfamiliar stirred within him. The feeling was subtle at first, like a dream pressing against the edges of waking thought. Rinoa followed, then Zell and Selfie, each of them slowing without realizing why. The orphanage rested before them, small and unassuming, yet heavy with a presence none of them could name. When Edea appeared, no longer commanding, no longer distant, the tension in the air shifted. She spoke calmly, gently, her voice lacking the cold authority it once carried. And then the memories began to surface. Not all at once, not cleanly. Laughter echoed faintly where silence had been. Children running along the shore. Shared meals. Arguments that ended quickly. Faces that felt impossibly familiar. One by one the pieces aligned, and the truth settled over them like a quiet tide. They had known each other before Garden, before Seed, before the world had hardened them into who they were now. Squall remembered standing apart even then, watching rather than joining. Zell remembered trying too hard to be noticed. Selphie remembered joy without fear, light without restraint. Irvine remembered everything, and the weight of having remembered alone pressed visibly into his expression as understanding finally replaced confusion. Guardian forces. Power borrowed at a cost never explained. The price had been memory, taken slowly, quietly, until the past faded just enough to leave only impressions behind. Edea listened as realization moved through them, her own sorrow evident but restrained. She had not been the enemy they thought. She had been controlled, used, her will overtaken by something far more distant and far more dangerous. Ultimecia. The name settled heavily, spoken like a truth long avoided. A sorceress from the future, reaching backward through time, bending lives and history toward a single purpose. Edea had been a vessel, a doorway, nothing more. As the sun dipped lower, painting the shoreline in soft gold, Squall stood silently, the weight of it all pressing inward. His past was no longer empty. It was full of connection, of loss, of bonds he had forgotten but never truly severed. The world felt different now, larger, older, and far less forgiving. The night around the orphanage grew still, the kind of quiet that settles only after something long buried has been brought into the open. Edea rested inside, her presence no longer heavy with power, but fragile, human. The sorceress who had stood above cities now lay weakened, her strength drained along with the force that had controlled her. Squall watched from a distance as explanations unfolded. Edea spoke carefully, as though each word required permission from the past. She remembered the moment her will had been overtaken, the sudden cold certainty that had pushed her aside. Ultimecia had not arrived with violence, but with inevitability, slipping into her mind and bending it toward a future none of them could see. The realization reshaped everything. Edea had not chosen conquest. She had been used as a bridge, one of many sorceresses destined to carry power they could never fully control. Ultimecia was moving through time itself, seeking a way to compress past, present, and future into a single moment she could rule without resistance. And Edea was no longer her vessel. The relief was quiet but unmistakable. Zell exhaled tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Selphie's expression softened, grief and gratitude mixing together. Irvine stood unusually still, the burden he had carried alone finally shared. Yet peace did not follow. If Ultimecia had lost Edea, she would seek another. The question was not if, but who. Rinoa shifted slightly, the movement almost unnoticeable, yet Squall's attention caught on it immediately. Something about her felt different, faintly displaced, as if the air around her resisted settling. She tried to smile, tried to reassure, but the warmth she usually carried felt thinner now, stretched over something uncertain. As they left the orphanage behind, dawn beginning to break softly over the horizon, Squall felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The enemy had changed shape, but not intent. The future was pressing closer, folding inward, and the space between what had been and what was yet to come was growing dangerously thin. They moved on without ceremony. Behind them, the past rested at last. Ahead, time itself was beginning to fracture. Sleep came unevenly, slipping in and out like a tide that refused to settle. When it finally took hold, the world changed without warning. Rain fell in slow, steady sheets over unfamiliar streets. The smell of metal and damp stone filled the air. Squall stood elsewhere now, watching through borrowed eyes as a man with long hair moved through a city alive with noise and confusion. Laguna ran awkwardly, shouting apologies as he went, tripping over his own feet, somehow surviving on momentum and luck alone. Kiros walked beside him with quiet patience, blades ready, movements smooth and efficient. Ward followed close behind, towering and silent, his presence steady as stone. Together, they pushed forward through chaos, soldiers advancing from all sides, gunfire echoing against walls too narrow for comfort. Laguna complained constantly about his leg, about the rain, about how this definitely was not how his life was supposed to go, but when danger closed in, he fought anyway. Not with grace, not with polish, but with stubborn determination and a strange kind of heart that refused to give in. The city fell away in fragments. Hiding places, close calls, laughter breaking through fear when it shouldn't have. And always, beneath it all, the sense that this was more than a dream. These moments mattered. They were being remembered for a reason. Then, just as suddenly, the world pulled away. Squall woke with a quiet jolt, the echo of rain still clinging to his thoughts. Around him, the others stirred as well, expressions unsettled, eyes distant. None of them spoke right away. They didn't need to. Laguna's story was not finished. It was woven into theirs now, threads crossing time and memory, tying past to present in ways that were only beginning to reveal themselves. Outside, Balamb Garden continued its slow journey forward, carrying them toward answers that waited far beyond sleep, beyond memory, and far beyond the world they thought they understood. The land ahead changed quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Familiar skies dulled, colors shifting towards something colder, sharper. What lay beyond was hidden from the world by intention rather than distance. A place spoken of rarely and seen even less. Esthar emerged not with walls or borders, but with silence. Technology humming beneath smooth surfaces, streets too clean, too controlled, as if chaos itself had been edited out. Laguna's presence lingered in fragments as they moved through it. Records, echoes, machines built by hands that felt strangely close. His name surfaced again and again, not as a footnote, but as a figure of importance. Someone who had once stumbled through danger and somehow changed the shape of nations by accident and compassion alone. Here, the truth sharpened. Ultimecia was no longer just a distant threat. Her goal took form in quiet explanations and carefully 77,777 chosen words. Time compression. A future pulled inward until everything, past, present, possibility, collapsed into a single point of control. A world without flow, without resistance, without escape. Rinoa listened closely, her expression thoughtful, troubled. She asked questions the others didn't, sensing the weight beneath the answers. Squall watched her from a distance, uneasy without knowing why. The sense of displacement around her had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Machines whispered, screens flickered. The future felt close here, uncomfortably close, as though it were leaning back to observe them in return. When they left Esthar behind, the world felt heavier. Knowledge had done what battles could not. It had narrowed their options. There was no avoiding what lay ahead now. Time itself had become the battlefield. And somewhere beyond sight, Ultimecia was already preparing, patient and certain, waiting for the moment when the world would finally fold. Stars stretched endlessly beyond the glass, distant and silent, scattered like fragments of forgotten dreams. The station drifted alone against the vastness, its corridors hushed, its lights dimmed to a soft glow. Inside, Rinoa rested uneasily, her breathing slow but unsettled, as though her body were present while something else moved just out of reach. The change came without warning. Her eyes opened, unfocused, and the air around her seemed to tighten. Movements that were not her own guided her steps, calm and deliberate. Ultimecia's presence slipped forward, smooth and absolute, taking hold without force. Words spoken through Rinoa's voice carried a cold certainty, distant and unfamiliar, echoing through the sterile halls. By the time Squall realized what was happening, it was already too late. Emergency doors sealed. Alarms pulsed softly, more resigned than urgent. Rinoa was placed into containment, her body suspended in silence, drifting slowly into open space. Outside the station, the planet curved below, blue and impossibly far away. The void waited patiently, indifferent and endless. Squall moved without hesitation. He launched himself after her, the world falling away as he crossed the impossible distance with only momentum and resolve. Time seemed to slow, stars blurring into faint lines as he reached her, arms closing around her fragile stillness. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own breath, loud in his ears, and the quiet certainty that he would not let go. They drifted together, two figures suspended between worlds, until at last the station drew them back in. Inside, gravity returned, gentle and grounding. Rinoa stirred, consciousness slowly reclaiming her place, confusion giving way to warmth as she realized she was not alone. They said little after that. Words felt unnecessary. The stars remained outside, distant once more, but something had shifted. The space between them had closed, not just in the void, but somewhere deeper, where fear and trust quietly meet. And far beyond the station, unseen and unmoved, Ultimecia continued to wait. The world began to fold in on itself. At first, it felt like a pressure behind the eyes, a subtle pulling sensation that made distance feel unreliable. Paths twisted where they should have been straight, horizons blurred, bending inward as if the land were remembering something incorrectly. Time no longer moved forward, it circled, overlapped, collapsed. Ultimecia's will pressed down like a slow tide. Past, present, and future lost their boundaries, bleeding together in quiet distortion. Familiar places appeared only to fade again, half-formed echoes stitched together by force rather than memory. The sky itself seemed uncertain, colors washing into one another without warning. Squall pushed forward through it all, grounded by movement, by purpose. Around him, Zell clenched his fists, frustrated by the way reality refused to stay still. Selphie tried to keep her balance. Her usual energy softened into focus as the world shifted beneath her feet. Irvine stayed close, unusually quiet, his awareness sharp and steady. Rinoa walked beside Squall, her presence both comforting and fragile. The pull of Ultimecia lingered around her, faint but undeniable, like a shadow that refused to fully separate. Squall said nothing, but his steps never drifted far from hers. Then the castle emerged. It rose from the distortion like a memory made solid, towers spiraling upward, stone warped by impossible geometry, gates standing open as if in invitation rather than challenge. Ultimesh's castle did not feel built. It felt imposed, anchored at the center of time's collapse. As they crossed the threshold, something vital was taken. Sound dulled, strength waned, abilities they had relied on vanished, stripped away and sealed behind unseen locks. The castle demanded trials, not of power, but of persistence. One by one, guardians revealed themselves, twisted reflections bound to ancient halls. Each victory restored something lost. Each step forward reclaimed a piece of what it meant to fight, to survive, to choose. Between battles, silence ruled. The castle breathed slowly, patiently, as if confident it would outlast them all. At its highest point, time trembled. Ultimesha waited beyond it, certain and unafraid, her presence woven into the fabric of everything that remained. The end of the path stood clearly now, no longer hidden by confusion or doubt. And as Squall stepped forward into the last distortion, memory and resolve aligned at last. The world could bend, time could break, but some connections refused to disappear. The castle's highest chamber opened into something that barely resembled a room. Stone twisted into impossible angles, arches stretching and folding as if unsure which direction they belonged to. The air itself felt strained, vibrating softly, as though time were being held together by will alone. Ultimesha stood at the center of it all. She did not rush, she did not raise her voice. Power surrounded her with effortless certainty, ancient and patient, drawn from a future that no longer cared to remain distant. Her presence felt less like an enemy and more like an ending that had already decided to happen. The battle unfolded without mercy. Magic tore through the chamber in sweeping arcs, light and shadow colliding in controlled violence. The ground shifted beneath every step. Ultimesha changed forms as if shedding skins, each one colder, more removed from humanity than the last. She spoke of inevitability, of a world perfected through stillness, where nothing could resist because nothing could move. Squall answered without words. Steel met sorcery. Momentum carried him forward when reason might have faltered. Zell's strikes landed with raw force, each blow fueled by refusal. Selphie moved with sharp focus, her energy contained and deliberate. Irvine fired with precision, calm reclaimed in the place where it mattered most. And Rinoa stood firm, not as a vessel, not as a doorway, but as herself. When the final clash came, it did not arrive with noise, but with release. Ultimesia's power fractured, unraveling as the compression she had forced upon time began to collapse under its own weight. The castle trembled, then began to fade, its purpose undone. But victory did not come cleanly. As the distortion tore itself apart, Squall felt the ground vanish beneath him. Light swallowed everything. Sound dissolved. The last thing he sensed was motion without direction, falling, drifting, becoming unanchored. The battle was over. Time was breaking, and Squall Leonhart was slipping beyond it. There was no ground, no sky, no sense of direction at all. Squall drifted through a silence so complete it felt heavier than noise. Colors bled into one another without shape or meaning, memories flashing and dissolving before he could grasp them. Faces appeared, then slipped away. Places overlapped, bending and folding as if time itself were searching for something it had misplaced. He tried to move, but movement had lost its rules. Fragments of the world surfaced in brief, unstable moments. Balamb Garden under a pale sky. The training hall, steel ringing clean and sharp. A shoreline washed in warm light. Children laughing. A girl running ahead, turning back just long enough to smile before the image fractured and vanished. The pull was constant, dragging him deeper into the compression Ultimecia had unleashed. Past and future pressed in from all sides, offering no anchor, no single moment to stand within. Squall felt himself thinning, stretched across memories that refused to align. Fear crept in quietly, not loud, not sudden, but cold and disorienting. Not fear of death, but of being lost, of becoming nothing more than scattered moments with no place to return to. Then, faintly, something held. A promise. Not spoken, not heard, but felt, steady and warm against the distortion. The memory sharpened, pushing back against the blur. Rinoa, standing beneath open sky. Rinoa, reaching out without hesitation. Rinoa, waiting. Squall focused on that feeling, letting it cut through the chaos. The world resisted, pulling harder, but the memory did not break. It grew clearer, stronger, until it became a direction rather than a thought. He moved toward it. Slowly, painfully, the fragments began to align. The noise of collapsing time dulled, the pull weakened. And though the void did not disappear, it loosened its grip just enough for Squall to keep going. Guided not by logic, not by orders, but by connection. Somewhere beyond the distortion, something real was waiting, and he refused to let go. The pressure eased in uneven waves, like water pulling back from shore, only to return again. Shapes began to settle. Sound crept in softly, indistinct at first, then slowly finding form. Squall felt weight return to his body, not all at once, but piece by piece, grounding him where moments before there had been nothing to stand on. Light broke through the haze. He lay beneath an open sky, its blue vast and steady, the kind of sky that made the world feel real simply by existing. Grass stirred gently in the breeze. The air smelled familiar, alive. For a long moment, Squall didn't move. He simply breathed, letting the certainty of the moment anchor him fully. Nearby, laughter rose, uneven, relieved, unmistakably real. Zell's voice carried first, loud and disbelieving, as if saying it out loud might make it permanent. Selfies followed, lighter, almost tearful, joy spilling over without restraint. Irvine leaned back against a railing, hat tilted low, a quiet smile replacing the tension he had carried for so long. And then there was Rinoa. She stood a short distance away, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on Squall as though she were afraid he might fade if she looked away. When he finally met her gaze, something unspoken passed between them, relief, disbelief, gratitude, all folding together into a warmth that required no explanation. Around them, Balamb Garden drifted peacefully once more, no longer caught between war or time or impossible futures. The engines hummed steadily. The sea stretched out beyond the edge, calm and endless. Ultimecia was gone. Time flowed forward again, unbroken. For the first time in what felt like forever, nothing demanded urgency. Nothing pressed in. The world simply existed, and that was enough. Squall rose slowly to his feet. The future was still uncertain. Questions remained, but the fear of being lost, truly lost, had loosened its hold. He was here, and that, for now, was everything. Night settled gently over the garden. Lights glowing softly along its edges, like distant stars brought closer to Earth. Music drifted through open spaces, unhurried and warm, carrying with it a sense of celebration that did not demand attention. It simply existed, waiting for anyone willing to step into it. Squall stood apart at first, watching from the shadows as familiar faces moved freely now, laughing, talking, alive in a way that felt earned rather than forced. Zell's energy returned in full, his joy loud and unmistakable. Selphie danced without hesitation, the weight she had carried finally set down. Irvine leaned against a railing, relaxed at last, tipping his hat with a quiet contentment. Rinoa searched the crowd until she found him. She didn't call out. She didn't rush. She simply walked toward him, her presence steady, unafraid of silence. When she reached him, she held out her hand, not as an invitation that needed words, but as a promise already understood. Morning came slowly, sunlight spilling across the garden's white stone and catching on metal railings, as if the world itself were waking gently after a long night. The sea below moved in an easy rhythm, waves brushing the shore with patient certainty. Everything felt lighter now, unburdened by urgency or fear. Squall stood near the edge, watching the horizon stretch endlessly ahead. The future remained unwritten, but it no longer felt empty or threatening. It felt open. Behind him, life continued in small, ordinary ways. Students returned to routines that no longer felt fragile. Laughter echoed down corridors once shaped only by discipline. The garden drifted not as a weapon or a fortress, but as a place of possibility. Rinoa joined him quietly, leaning against the railing, her presence familiar and grounding. They stood together without speaking, sharing the calm that followed survival. There was no need to define what came next. Whatever it would be faced together. Elsewhere, Zell's voice carried through the air, animated as ever, already planning ahead. Selphie darted past, full of energy and excitement, dreaming aloud about rebuilding, about festivals and new beginnings. Irvine watched it all with an easy smile, content to let the moment exist without complication. Far from here, time moved forward as it always had, no longer bent, no longer broken. The echoes of sorceresses and forgotten futures faded into memory, becoming stories instead of threats. As the garden sailed on beneath a clear sky, Squall closed his eyes briefly, letting the breeze wash over him. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt complete. The journey had begun with distance and restraint, shaped by loss he never remembered having. It ended not with certainty, but with connection, with trust, with shared memory, with the quiet understanding that even in a world shaped by time and fate, some bonds endure. And as the garden carried them forward, the story found its rest, not in an ending, but in peace. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey through Final Fantasy VIII. If the story brought you comfort or memories, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can also leave a comment. Tell me your favorite part of the game, or which story you'd like us to wander through next. Until then, may your nights be restful, your dreams gentle, and your heart full of adventure. Good night.